Something that's been in and out of the news for a while now is the existence of AI-generated books on Amazon. And of particular interest to me, books on the topic of foraging mushrooms or other wild foods. Let's see if we can find a couple of examples of these books and take a closer look at them. As I've mentioned in videos specifically about foraging, there is a safety angle to it. If you just go skipping out of your door and putting random berries, leaves and mushrooms in your mouth, you're probably going to poison yourself. It definitely is possible to learn to do it safely, but this takes an investment of effort in learning how to identify things, as well as learning a few safe and also ethical guiding principles. Can a book that was written by an algorithm teach that correctly and safely? I believe the answer is no, or at least not 100%, and less than 100% is worthless in this field. Although scams are everywhere, and I see them quite often, trying to deliberately get scammed by a specific type of scam at a specific moment in time is sometimes surprisingly hard. I search for foraging books on Amazon, and there are quite a lot of them. Some are fairly obviously okay, books I've already got on my shelf, or I've already seen, or where I already know and trust the author. But I don't know, and I haven't seen everything. So there are also books that are probably okay, but I couldn't tell without buying them. And I'm really looking for something that looks wrong just from the Amazon listing. So here's the first one I found. It's called The Simple Forager's Ultimate Guide to Nutritious Wild Foods book, Nature's Hidden Treasures, Unlocking the Secrets of Wild Edibles, Lichens and Mushrooms. Something about even that title says keyword stuffing. The front cover looks fairly innocuous at a glance, but this hexagonal pattern background looks AI generated to me. Like it's supposed to represent a collection of vignettes of various different things perhaps, but I don't recognise an actual object in any of them. The back cover appears to have a definition of wild foods in large print, which is just a weird random thing to put on a back cover. The text here smells to me like something that came out of generative AI, as does the blurb in the Amazon product description. If you're wondering what it is that I'm seeing in this text that makes me suspect it's generated, it's not completely easy to pin down and describe. But one thing is the adjectival verbosity. ChatGPT in particular, if, for example, you ask it to say something about food, often it won't just say, here's how to make delicious food. It will say something like, here's how to plan, prepare and make food that is delicious, nutritious and fun, in ways that will surprise, entertain and delight your friends, family and guests. Why use one word to describe something when you can use three? Also, the Amazon blurb for this one talks about what might even be a different book called Wild at Heart. So this might be a recycled description from an earlier phase of the same scam. Okay, so I suspect this book will be AI generated, so I ordered it to take a look. The hard copy version rather than the Kindle edition, because I'm curious about what will actually turn up. Will it just be a bunch of laser printed pages stapled together, or an actual book? We won't have to wait long to find out. The next book I looked at is called The Forager's Guide to Wild Foods, the Ultimate Handbook on How to Locate, Identify, Harvest and Cook Wild Edible Plants, Berries and Mushrooms. This one is suspicious for most of the same reasons as the other one we just looked at, so I won't go into massive depth here, but the stink of GPT in the Amazon blurb was quite palpable. This one gives more clues about being AI generated in the preview, starting with this not quite realistic photo of strawberries, which if they were real would not be wild strawberries anyway, because we can see this is growing on a planter or something. But I don't think this is even a real picture. I've got strawberries in my garden, and I've seen the leaves a lot, so these just seem wrong to me in a bunch of subtle ways. There's a huge table of contents. Interestingly, apparently including the universal edibility test, which I think we'll talk about when and if the book arrives. Then we get to the introduction with what looks to be an AI-generated painting of a not very wild scene, but it's the text that's the real treat here. Allow me to read a few excerpts. Alex, my childhood friend, lived in the vast fields, which would make sense if Alex was a horse, where old trees and sun-kissed meadows were present. Well, yes, it's nice of the trees and meadows to show up in the vast fields. It goes on to say how Alex's, who remember is the author's childhood friend, interest in foraging somehow turned into a book, this book. Then weirdly it goes on as if this book is now the main character of the story. The book enticed readers to renew their relationship with the land. The guide urged readers to put themselves in the shoes of a forager. And again there's a preface that smells of GPT just from the structure of it without even looking at the words. Anyway, we'll look closer at these pages later if and when the book arrives, because yes, I ordered this one too. Now we just have to wait. A parcel has arrived. Let's open it up to see what we got inside. So, two books, two curiously rather similarly presented books. A matte cover kind of looks like they came off the same process. This one is all text, It contains no pictures at all. This one, yeah, I mean, it does look like a document that's been printed and bound. But yeah, these look like maybe print on demand or something like that. One thing that's missing. So, Rowan Finch, PhD, where's the section that says about the author? If there was a person who was an expert in foraging, would there not be a little bit of a biography in there? Yeah, so look, printed in Great Britain. And yeah, that little page in the back there is exactly the same, by Amazon, so printed by Amazon. So this is some sort of print-on-demand service that Amazon has. Anyway, I'm going to go off now and read these books, and I'll give you my honest opinion. So I would call that a huge disappointment, except that disappointment implies surprise, and I'm not surprised at all here. These books have probably been printed on demand by Amazon's Kindle Direct Publishing system, which honestly is not the most terrible concept in the world. And if, for example, you were the author of some very esoteric book that no publishing house would be interested in touching, you could use Amazon's KDP to sell printed copies of your work in small volumes very easily. But the flip side of that ease is it enables abominations such as these to exist. And these supposed foraging books are utterly dreadful. Let me show you by means of a quick tour. So, The Simple Forager's Ultimate Guide to Nutritious Wild Foods book, Nature's Hidden Treasures, Unlocking the Secrets of Wild Edibles, Lichens and Mushrooms. 6 pages of title and table of contents. Then we start over at page 1 again with an introduction to foraging, which is very clearly written by a generative algorithm. You can tell just from how it's split up into perfectly uniform paragraphs which contain quite a lot of words, but at the same time say very little. Note also the double-spaced lines. There are a lot of tricks like that in this so-called book, which would be more of a pamphlet if we took out all of the padding and repetition. I'll get to the repetition in a moment. The Getting Started section is actually not terrible. It does cover some relatively important and sound points about foraging ethics, such as not taking all of anything, and correct identification using reputable sources, by which I can only assume it means books other than this one. But the subsections here contain significant duplication of the topics they're discussing, and I think that's another key indicator that this book is AI generated, because often there's a limit on the output length from generative AI algorithms, and I think this one's been generated in pieces that could have just been appended together. But each piece doesn't know it's repeating something that was in one of the other pieces. For example, the part about foraging on private land on page 24 repeats some of the things said on that topic back on page 13. There's nothing necessarily wrong with repeating something for emphasis, it's just that this book does it an awful lot. Because it's not so much as a book, as it is just a concatenation of lazy homework assignments. Anyway, onward. On page 31 we get to some actual information about identifying wild plants, if you can call it information. The information given here for dandelion, for example, isn't enough to differentiate it from any of a few dozen other plants in the same family. Fortunately, mistakes there would only tend to be inedible rather than poisonous. But the plant descriptions here are just absurdly vague, and there are no photos at all in the whole book. Turning over to page 32, we've suddenly finished with plant identification now, and we're talking about ethical foraging practices again, repeating many of the same points made just a few pages earlier more than once, but perhaps that was just a preamble. So let's leaf forward to page 43, titled Identifying Wild Plants. Here we've got some more information, except it's just slightly different, still sketchy descriptions of the same plants we just looked at. Dandelions, nettles, chickweed. Then over the page it starts talking about ethical foraging practices all over again. More sketchy descriptions of again the same plants are found on pages 51 and 52, before this chapter closes with a final paragraph about ethical foraging practices. From page 56 we're looking at berries, and descriptions are given for 10 different species, before the text turns back to, you guessed it, discussion, or rather repetition, of safe and ethical foraging practices. Then on page 63 we hit the recipes section, which contains, wait for it, 5 recipes, which actually look like they might be okay. But I think the reader wants more information about forageable foods, so fear not, this resumes on page 70, which is about edible greens, specifically the same edible greens that have already been described twice already. But in case you missed that, here are some more sketchy descriptions of dandelions, nettles and chickweed, but it's also important to take notice from considerations regarding safe and ethical foraging practices. Next, on page 78, we're going to look at some edible roots and tubers. This is where it gets dangerous. The description here of wild carrot as a white tapered root resembling a domestic carrot, often with feathery leaves. Well, yes, that is a description of a wild carrot, but this description would also fit a number of other plants in the carrot family, which are toxic or sometimes deadly poisonous, such as fool's parsley is one example, or of course hemlock water dropwort. Then there's wild yam, which isn't something that even grows here in the UK, and this highlights another issue with this book. Nowhere does it specify any geographical region for which it's supposedly relevant, and that's hugely important in foraging. One of the most common causes of death by accidental poisoning is when people familiar with foraging in one place move to a different continent and make the wrong assumptions about similar looking things they find there. And yeah, the vague context of this book therefore does seem to be the United States, but I found this book when I was searching for UK foraging books. That's probably more of a problem with Amazon's search algorithm than the book itself. Anyway, wild yam is described as a twining vine with starchy tuberous roots found in woodlands and forest edges. That's it. That's the entirety of the description. And that description exactly fits at least 3 things I can think of which grow here, which will poison and possibly kill you. Those things are white and black bryony and common bindweed. So by being completely unspecific about its geographic scope and hopelessly terse and vague in its plant descriptions, this book could actually cause someone to accidentally poison themselves. Page 93 discusses wild herbs and flowers, again repeating dandelions and nettles, and other things already mentioned. Page 96 is about safe and ethical foraging. This repetition is getting dull, so we'll skip ahead to the section about mushrooms, noting only that we're breezing past the discussion of safe and ethical foraging in the edible flowers section. The book sternly cautions you to know your mushrooms, whilst simultaneously not offering any tangible help in attaining that knowledge. This page, 101, says basically eat the edible ones and watch out for the dangerous ones. And apparently that's really about all you need to know. But anyway, before we get to the descriptions of species, here are a few words about safe and ethical foraging. The descriptions of edible fungi on pages 104 and 5 and toxic species on 106 are as useless as ever. And the book recommends using a book or an app for accurate species recognition. Terrible advice. Nature recognition apps are good, but far from perfect, especially imperfect for fungi. An app can help to point you in the right direction toward identifying a thing, but it should never be the primary or sole identification factor for something you intend to eat. Anyway, we're only about halfway through this torrent of rubbish, and I've lost the will to talk any further about the shortcomings of this book. All I will say is that the second half is as vapid and fruitless as the first half. Safe and ethical foraging is discussed, that is to say repeated, a further 12 times in the remaining pages, and dandelions and nettles are described vaguely and incompletely a further 4 times. By the time I'd finished reading and analysing this book to write this script, Amazon had already removed it from sale. Fortunately, that didn't prevent me from returning it and getting a refund. Next, let's take a look inside the Forager's Guide to Wild Foods, the ultimate handbook on how to locate, identify, harvest and cook wild edible plants, berries and mushrooms. Oh boy, at least this one has pictures, right? We already looked at the introduction page and the weird backstory about Alex, who definitely wasn't a horse, but lived in the vast open fields where old trees and sun-kissed meadows were present. Let's skip to the art of foraging, which absolutely reeks of ChatGPT, right down to the bullet point list of arguments, and emphasising its point by using 3 adjectives or sets of 3 terms. There are lists of bullet points on principles, benefits and ethical practices. Nothing egregiously wrong in here that I could spot, but it's so mechanical in the writing that I found it hard to focus on. The section about understanding wild foods is not exactly wrong. It just takes a whole page to say pretty much nothing more than look at things. Then, over the page, we've got the Universal Edibility Test. Now, the Universal Edibility Test, or UET, is a methodology that's appeared in many survival guides and other books, and notionally it's a way to determine whether a plant you encounter is toxic or edible, by carefully exposing your body to it incrementally on your skin for a few moments, then longer, then on your lip, then chewing it without swallowing, and so on, with various wait times to see if you develop rashes or blisters or feel sick. I'm not sure the UET has ever really had much practical application. In a survival situation, such as a pilot downed on a remote island or in a remote area, finding out whether you can eat the leaves of local plants is really pretty low on your list of survival priorities. Food is probably one of the top 4 priorities, the others being shelter, water and fire. The order of those other 3 is arguable, but food is nearly always at least number 4, and in some cases may not even be in the top 4. But also, the usefulness of the UET is limited. In terms of energy, it's going to be pretty difficult to survive on leaves. But regardless of all of that, the Universal Edibility Test has no place at all as earnest advice in a coffee table book about foraging in a non-emergency context. Proper identification of species is something that can be learned instead, and it's just better in every way than messing about with whether a plant causes a rash when you rub it on your elbow. And of course the UET is pretty useless in evaluating mushrooms, as some of those won't kill you until several days after you've eaten them. Anyway, the book rambles on with GPT-looking bullet point lists until we get to the bottom of page 19, where we're apparently going to learn about popular edible mushrooms. And turning over, we got a list of single paragraph descriptions of various species of mushrooms, but they must have prompted ChatGPT for a list of edible fungi without mentioning enough about foraging, because some of these descriptions seem to be talking about the availability of these mushrooms in shops. Regardless, none of these descriptions is sufficiently detailed for proper identification. Over on page 22, we begin a section promisingly and tautologically titled Wild Foods That Can Be Foraged in the Wild. This section goes on to page 29 with an arrangement of 5 photos and underneath a list of 5 plants or fungi, except none of the text matches the pictures. For example, this page with pictures of fungi has text for nuts and seeds. This appears to be due to a missing page break back on page 22. The names actually precede the pictures, and this might just be a quirk of the way Amazon's Kindle Direct Publishing has printed out the book, or more likely a complete lack of care on the person who copied and pasted all this generative AI stuff into one document. Then there are some more pages with unreadable lists of things, followed by a section of animals you can find while foraging. Do you fancy foraging a bear? Apparently you can. The book doesn't mention any specific safety concerns with this animal, so I guess it must be safe. Immediately following that, we're back into those lists again, the first of which is about navigating with natural landmarks, where ChatGPT seems to have waxed a bit poetic. Be mindful of the sun's lovely movement across the sky, and because it contains local knowledge, the wind's gentle words are worth listening to. From page 65, we're looking at recipes. These seem to be real recipes, and the accompanying pictures don't have any obvious signs of being generated to my eye, but it's not always easy to tell with pictures of food. The writing in this section is just abruptly different from the writing in the earlier part of the book. I suspect this section might have been copied out from somebody else's published work. These recipes form the largest section of the book so far, continuing to page 120, where we switch briefly back to those generated bullet point lists again. Then the remainder of the book is given over to templates for a diary or journal of foraging observations, which is a nice easy way to fill up the remaining 50 pages and make this feel like a book, not a pamphlet. So, conclusions. Both of these books are useless to anyone who is at any stage of learning to forage, and for books that both contain the word ultimate in the title, they're both desperately short on actual usable content. Indeed, the only sense in which either of these might be ultimate is that if you follow the guidance inside, you might just not be alive to buy any more books after these. Both clearly heavily relying on AI-generated text, both padded out with irrelevant material, repetition, or just wide line spacing to attain their page count. Both utterly without merit and potentially dangerous. I also returned the other book and got a refund, and on that one the listing was still up, so I was able to write a 1-star review. But that review, if it isn't just deleted by Amazon for being negative, will disappear when this book is delisted, which I'm sure it will be, only to be replaced by something nearly identical in its vacuous and potentially harmful nature. I suppose that might be the other sense in which these books might be ultimate, in that it's just absurdly simple now for scammers to churn this out in huge volume and list on Amazon. Perhaps that is the ultimate state of online publishing, to be hopelessly mired by a flood of utterly worthless content. But we can't end on that cheerless note. Okay, so if you want to learn foraging, what book should you buy? I can't give you one specific book recommendation here because of that thing I mentioned earlier about information having geographic relevance. My advice is to visit a physical bookshop and pick up a field guide on plants and flowers and maybe fungi. You'll know it's a useful book just by looking to see if it bothers to go into much detail about each species it describes. Field guides aren't foraging books, but if you want to learn foraging, you should start by learning to identify things in a more general sense. Once you've made tracks into that skill set, you can probably ask for recommendations on a good, locally relevant foraging guide in that same bookshop, and they'd be able to order it in for you if they don't already have it. Support your local bookshop. So let's go and actually do that. Let's go to a couple of bookshops and look for some foraging and nature sort of field guide type books. But before we do, let's just have a look at the contrast between real and fake. So this is the fake one. Amazon told me not to bother sending it back. This is the one that was delisted before I initiated the return. So this one's mine to keep forever, and what a joy that is. So the difference between a fake and a real one. These are two real. That's a field guide to Mediterranean wildflowers, which I bought because obviously I go for rambles in Spain when I go to visit my mum there. So the first thing to notice is that it's specific about the area it pertains to, because that's really important. Geographic specificity is absolutely vital, and so this is a complete guide to the flowers of Mediterranean coasts and islands, native and introduced. So that's the first thing. The next thing is just really to look at the kind of the density of the information here. So this one's got a huge glossary of terms with diagrams telling you what it means, what all these terms mean. It's got some discussion about plant families. But then when we get into the actual meat of the book, so all of the illustrations in this one are concentrated in the middle of the colour plates in the middle. So very, very detailed paintings of the various different species, showing you all of the different features. The thing I like about paintings in field guides is everything's there on purpose. So every little feature they've drawn or painted here is there to tell you something about the plant, whereas a photograph might sometimes miss things if it's not present on that specimen. But anyway, the plants are very, very well illustrated, and then in this particular book they are numbered, and then you go and look up the number in the text, which is, you know, just a different way to do it. I think it's just because of the necessity of printing colour versus black and white. Everything in this description is a description of parts of the plant or individual details of the plants. Now you might think it's a bit weird me saying that the descriptions of dandelions in those other two books were inadequate, because everybody knows what dandelions are, which is fair enough, but the description of dandelions in that other book, which I've now returned, would have fit pretty much any of these things. Actually, I'm not sure dandelions are going to be in here. This is obviously Mediterranean plants, so this is not necessarily going to have dandelions in it. But anyway, let's go and find something that's similar. 2044. 2044, tuberous hawkbit. So look at this, tuberous rooted, low to short, hairy perennial, leaves borne in a basal rosette, oval to oblong, generally widest above the middle, toothed to pinnately lobed, the lobes being generally pointing somewhat backwards, flower heads golden yellow, 20 to 28 millimeters, solitary on long, unbranched, hairy stalks, florets all rayed, the outer often green on the reverse, flower bracts oblong, hairy or not, achenes 3 to 7 millimeters long, usually beaked, two kinds, the outer curved, the inner straight, pappus feathery, garrigue, grassy places, open scrub, roadsides, lowland and in the mountains. So just look at the amount of information they crammed into one little paragraph there, compared to the other book, which just basically said, yeah, it's got leaves and yellow flowers. And don't forget, all of these terms here, like achenes and florets and rays and pappus and bracts and so on, are all explained in great detail in that glossary of terms. So rays, pappus, which is the thistledown tuft of hairs on achenes. So we better look at the achenes. Achenes are a single seeded dry fruit, not splitting. So all of these different, so just anyway, the thing I want to impress upon you is information density is characteristic of any good field guide, is it will try to tell you as much as it can about all of the different plants, because not only is everything it's telling you in here about that plant, it's also telling you those descriptors are actually differentiators as well. So those things that it's telling you about the plant are not just descriptions of the plant, they're descriptions of how that plant differs from everything else. So that's that one. That's not the UK, but again, it's a really good field guide. And Food for Free, which is a classic, very, very well respected foraging guide. So again, if we look in the preface, it's very clear from reading this book that it's talking about Great Britain. Do we, living in a built-up, over-farmed and overpopulated country like Britain, need a kind of foraging ethic? So, geographic specificity. And then information density again. So this is not such a dense book, but let's go and look up dandelions. So, dandelions. There's a really good picture of the flowers. Widespread and abundant in open and grassy places throughout British Isles, leaves grow from base of plant and are roughly toothed. The whole plant exudes a milky juice when cut. Flowers February to November, but especially April and May. Largish golden yellow flowers made up of numerous fine petals on hollow stems up to 30 centimetres tall. And then it goes on, even though we know a lot about dandelions already anyway, because they're such a common thing. But there's just a lot of, again, information density. This is not a field guide, but one of the things this will do, this book tells you about things like fool's parsley and hemlock water dropwort. So it gives you descriptions of the things that you might mistake for edible, which of course these books didn't care about. And that comes from the fact that this book is written by someone who cares about the topic. This is not something that somebody's just plunged together. This is a book written by somebody who's passionate about the topic and is very passionate about communicating the relevant information from the topic. So there we go. So that's what to look for in good field guides, is geographic specificity and information density. So anyway, I went out to a couple of bookshops and there were quite a nice range of interesting books about plants and about nature and so on, but also a good section of field guides, including some that I already have and some that I don't have in my collection but are really good. And again, I just opened a couple of those and look at the information density. And then I actually found in a charity shop, I found this, the Larousse Pocket Guide to Wildflowers of Britain and Northern Europe, Geographic Specificity. 850 species, fact panels, colour coding, the biggest little guide. This actually seems to be pretty good, so I bought it. I really only went to capture some footage of me looking at books in bookshops, but this one was so good I couldn't resist. One thing I really like about this is this has got a section about how to use this book. So this is about setting your expectations for what you can get from this book and how to best make use of the information in it, which is really useful. But let's find dandelion in here and see what this book has to say about dandelions. So look at this. In fact, let me move the camera so we can get a closer look. So picture the whole plant above ground here, which is a painting or drawing. Detail of the flower, detail of one of the florets, and then the seed with its little parachute, its little pappus on it. Not a massive amount of description in this little section here, but look at the information in this fact panel here. So all organised by the different petals and sepals and stamens and stigma and root and hairs and stipules and all of those kind of things. Also, it tells you about similar species, so things you might mistake for this plant. So yeah, that is the difference between real nature books and fake nature books, is really as simple as that. And that's what to look for if you're going shopping for a decent field guide or foraging guide, is geographic specificity and information density. Anyway, I hope that's been useful or interesting or something. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.